The pristine white curb gleamed under the relentless Florida sun, an almost mocking perfection against the jarring scene unfolding. A man clearly in distress, his face pale and beaded with sweat, was being roughly manhandled against the side of a nondescript sedan by a woman in a crisp, if ill-fitting security uniform. His left hand, gnarled and bearing the faded blue ink of a military tattoo, was twisted behind his back at an unnatural angle. A small insulated cooler lay on its side, on the manicured lawn of 12 Cherry Blossom Lane, its contents likely precious spilled and glinting in the harsh light. From his shaded position beneath the sprawling live oak across the street, General Marcus Thorne, retired, felt the familiar, unwelcome tightening in his chest, a sensation that always preceded the necessity of intervention. He had been enjoying the relative anonymity of his sister's quiet, upscale neighborhood, Havenwood Estates, a supposed sanctuary of peace and order. This was not order. This was something else entirely. Thorne had arrived in Havenwood only 2 days prior, seeking a respite from the endless consultations and board meetings that had defined his post-military career. His sister Sarah, a kind soul who worried incessantly about him, had insisted he needed a real break. He'd been taking a slow morning constitutional, appreciating the meticulously kept gardens and the almost unnerving silence when the delivery van, a modest vehicle driven by the man now being assaulted, had pulled up to Mrs. Henderson's house. He'd seen the driver, who walked with a pronounced limp, carefully extract the cooler. Then, the HOA security golf cart, driven by the woman whose voice now cut through the morning air like a serrated knife, had zipped around the corner. This is a restricted zone for commercial deliveries between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. The officer, whose name tag read B. Slattery Senior Patrol Officer, had announced, her voice amplified by a small, crackling speaker. The veteran, whose own bearing, despite his visible disability, hinted at past service, had turned. "Ma'am, this is a medical delivery for Mrs. Henderson. It's temperature sensitive." He gestured towards the cooler. "I'm just dropping it at her door." "Rules are rules." Slattery had snapped, her eyes small and hard, raking over him. "And you're parked facing the wrong way on a one-way designated access lane. That's a $75 fine, license and registration." Thorne watched the exchange, his initial irritation at the officiousness turning to concern. The veteran, whose name he would later learn was David Riley, had tried to reason. "Look, I'm a volunteer. This is life-saving medication. Can't we just—" "Are you refusing to comply with a directive from a Havenwood Estate security officer?" Slattery's voice rose, attracting the attention of a few curtain-twitching neighbors. Riley sighed, reaching for his wallet. "No, I'm not refusing. Just asking for a little understanding." He'd handed over his documents. That's when the situation had deteriorated rapidly. Slattery had taken an inordinate amount of time scrutinizing the papers, then declared his vehicle had an expired local delivery permit. A permit Thorne was fairly certain didn't exist for private vehicles making volunteer deliveries. When Riley had protested calmly but firmly, stating he was a disabled veteran and this was a charitable act, Slattery had escalated. "Don't you take that tone with me? You people always think you're above the law. Step out of the vehicle. You're being detained for disorderly conduct and violation of HOA covenants. Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 4, unauthorized commercial activity and improper vehicle orientation." That had been 10 minutes ago. Now Riley was pressed against his car, the contents of the cooler vials and small boxes scattered. The medicine. Thorne pushed himself off the oak tree, the quiet observer no more. His life before this interlude in Havenwood was a carefully constructed routine. Mornings began at 0500, a habit ingrained from decades in the Army. A run not as long as it used to be, but still rigorous enough to keep the edge of time at bay. Then coffee black and a scan of global news, his mind still tracking geopolitical fault lines, even in retirement. He consulted for several defense contractors, sat on the board of a veterans charity, and occasionally lectured at the War College. It was a life of purpose, but a different kind of purpose than commanding men in harm's way. Here in Havenwood, he was just Sarah's brother, a quiet man who kept to himself. He'd found a measure of peace in the manicured lawns and the predictable rhythm of suburban life, a stark contrast to the chaotic landscapes of his past. He often sat on Sarah's porch, observing the comings and goings, the silent ballet of sprinklers and dog walkers. He'd noted the HOA security patrols, their almost military precision in enforcing rules about lawn length and garbage can placement. It had seemed almost quaint, a parody of order until now. David Riley, a former Army sergeant, had a different routine. His day started with a complex regimen of pain medication and physical therapy for a leg shattered by an IED outside Fallujah. Mornings were a battle against phantom pains and the unyielding stiffness in his joints. But by mid-morning, he was usually mobile enough for his volunteer work. He delivered medications for a local charity, Vets for Vets, that helped homebound or disabled ex-servicemen and women. It gave him a sense of purpose, a connection to the community of those who had served. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow of a Korean War veteran, was one of his regular stops. Her insulin needed to be kept cold, hence the specialized cooler. He enjoyed their brief chats, her stories of her late husband, the small kindnesses exchanged. His old sedan, reliable if not pretty, was his lifeline, his means of contributing. He navigated the world with a quiet resilience, his disability a constant reminder of sacrifice, but not a definition of his existence. He understood rules, had lived by them his entire adult life in the military. But he also understood compassion, something that seemed utterly absent in Officer Slattery. The inciting conflict, as Thorne saw it, hadn't been the parking violation or the fictitious permit. It had been Slattery's immediate, unyielding assertion of dominance, her refusal to engage in any form of reasonable discourse. Riley had parked his car for perhaps 30 seconds before she pounced her golf cart, appearing as if summoned by some unseen violation detector. He'd stopped just past Mrs. Henderson's walkway, intending to be quick. The wrong way accusation was technically true for the small loop, but it was a loop with no other traffic, designed more for aesthetic symmetry than traffic flow. "Ma'am, please," Riley was saying, his voice strained. "My leg. The way you're holding me." Slattery grunted, applying more pressure. "Resisting lawful authority will only make it worse for you, buddy." Thorne started walking across the street, his pace unhurried but deliberate. He was dressed in civilian clothes, khaki trousers, and a plain polo shirt, nothing to denote his rank or past. He cultivated anonymity. "Officer," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of command. "What seems to be the problem here?" Slattery glanced at him, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "This is official HOA business, sir. Please step away." I saw the entire exchange. Thorne stated, his gaze steady. "This gentleman was attempting to deliver medication. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Slattery retorted, her grip tightening on Riley. Riley winced, a sharp intake of breath. "He's in violation of multiple Havenwood ordinances, and now he's resisting." "I am not resisting," Riley gasped out. "You're hurting me. The medicine, it's for Mrs. Henderson. It'll spoil." The scattered vials on the grass seemed to mock his plea. Thorne's eyes flicked to the spilled medication, then back to Slattery. "This man is clearly disabled, officer, and he's informed you of the urgent nature of his delivery. Your actions seem disproportionate." Slattery's face hardened. "Are you questioning my authority? Who are you anyway? Another rule breaker." She gave Riley's arm a vicious twist. A small cry of pain escaped Riley's lips. This was the first true shock, the deliberate infliction of pain, the blatant disregard for human dignity over petty rules. Thorne felt a cold anger rise in emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He kept his voice even. "I am a concerned resident, and I am witnessing what appears to be an abuse of authority. This man requires medical attention, not restraint." "Well, he's a threat." Slattery insisted, her eyes darting around, as if looking for validation from the silent watching windows. "He became aggressive when I cited him." "I saw no aggression," Thorne said, his voice like ice. "I saw you escalate a minor issue into a physical confrontation." He took another step closer. "Release him, now." Slattery seemed momentarily taken aback by the quiet force in his voice, but her ingrained belligerence quickly resurfaced. "I will not. He's being detained. I'm calling the county sheriff. You can explain your interference to them." She fumbled for her radio with one hand, her other still cruelly pinning Riley. "That's an excellent idea," Thorne said. "Call the sheriff. And while you're at it, you might want to request a paramedic for Mr. Riley, and perhaps legal counsel for yourself." The mention of legal counsel seemed to give Slattery pause, but only for a second. She got on her radio, her voice shrill and self-important. "Dispatch, this is Senior Patrol Officer Slattery, badge 7-1 here. I have a hostile individual resisting detention at 12 Cherry Blossom Lane. requesting immediate sheriff backup and get a supervisor down here. There's another individual interfering. Thorne noted the subtle shift, hostile individual, resisting detention. The narrative was being shaped. He looked at Riley, whose face was now ashen. "Stay calm, son," he said, his voice softer but still carrying. "Help is coming." Riley met his eyes, a flicker of desperate hope in them. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. The wait for the sheriff's deputies felt like an eternity, punctuated by Slattery's occasional mutterings about these people and the decline of respect for authority. Thorne remained silent, a sentinel of unwelcome justice in Slattery's carefully controlled fiefdom. He watched as she, with a theatrical sigh of effort, finally cuffed Riley, forcing his hands behind his back, then made him sit awkwardly and painfully on the curb. She made no move to retrieve the spilled medication. The sun beat down. One neighbor, a woman with kind eyes, Thorne had seen walking a small poodle, tentatively stepped onto her porch, a glass of water in her hand, clearly intending it for Riley. Slattery barked, "Ma'am, this is an active scene. Return to your residence." The woman retreated, looking distressed. This was the second shocking act, the deliberate isolation, the denial of even basic human kindness, the exertion of power, not for safety or order, but for its own sake. It was bullying pure and simple, masked by a uniform and a rulebook. Two county sheriff's deputies arrived their cruiser, pulling up with a quiet efficiency that contrasted sharply with Slattery's earlier histrionics. The senior deputy, a man named Peterson, approached Slattery first. Thorne listened as she launched into her version of events, a heavily embellished tale of Riley's supposed belligerence, his refusal to comply, his threatening posture. She painted herself as the calm professional officer, forced to take action. Deputy Peterson then turned to Thorne. "And you are, sir, Marcus Thorne. I'm a guest of my sister Sarah Jennings, who resides in this community. I witnessed the entire event." "And your account?" Peterson asked, his expression neutral. Thorne recounted what he had seen, calmly, factually, without embellishment. He pointed out the spilled medication, Riley's visible disability, and Slattery's immediate escalation. "Officer Slattery's actions were, in my assessment, unnecessarily aggressive and disproportionate to any alleged infraction." Slattery bristled. "He's lying. He's trying to protect his friend. I've never met Mr. Riley before today." Thorne stated, his gaze unwavering. Peterson looked from Thorne to Slattery, then to Riley, who was still sitting on the curb, his head bowed, the picture of dejection. "Mr. Riley," Peterson said, his tone more gentle. "Can you tell me what happened?" Riley slowly lifted his head. He spoke in a low, tired voice, detailing his attempts to explain the medical delivery, Slattery's refusal to listen, the pain from her restraining hold. "All I wanted to do was get Mrs. Henderson her medicine." He finished, his voice cracking slightly. "She needs it." Just then, an older woman, frail and using a walker, emerged from 12 Cherry Blossom Lane. It was Mrs. Henderson. "What is all this commotion?" she asked, her voice thin but clear. "David, is that you, dear? Where is my medicine?" Her eyes fell on the scattered vials on her lawn, then on Riley cuffed on the curb. A look of profound distress crossed her face. "Oh, my dear boy, what have they done to you?" Slattery stepped forward. "Ma'am, this man was causing a disturbance. Everything is under control." "Disturbance?" Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, her voice gaining surprising strength. "David Riley is a saint. He brings me my medicine, rain or shine. He's a good, kind man. You let him go this instant." Deputy Peterson held up a hand. "Ma'am, we're trying to sort this out. Officer Slattery, what specific violations are you alleging?" Slattery puffed herself up. "Improper parking, expired commercial permit, failure to comply, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct." Thorne interjected smoothly. "Deputy, I would question the legality of an expired commercial permit for a private citizen volunteering to deliver medicine in his personal vehicle, and failure to comply and resisting arrest seem to be precipitated entirely by Officer Slattery's aggressive actions. As for disorderly conduct, the only disorder I witnessed was initiated by Officer Slattery herself." Slattery's face was turning a mottled red. "This is outrageous. I am a sworn officer of the Havenwood Homeowners Association. I have a duty to uphold the covenants. Your duty also includes behaving professionally and with restraint," Thorne countered. He then looked at Deputy Peterson. "Deputy, I would like to formally request that Officer Slattery's body camera footage, if she is wearing one, be preserved. And I would also like to note that she made no effort to secure or preserve the medication, which is clearly vital. Slattery sputtered. My camera it malfunctioned earlier this morning. Battery died. Thorne raised an eyebrow. How convenient. Peterson seemed to be weighing the conflicting accounts. The presence of Mrs. Henderson, clearly vouching for Riley and Thorne's articulate, authoritative demeanor, seemed to be giving him pause. All right, Peterson said. Mr. Riley, I'm going to have these cuffs taken off you for now, but you're not free to leave. We need to get to the bottom of this. Officer Slattery, I need your full written report on this incident, and I'll need your supervisor's contact information. My supervisor is on his way, Slattery said stiffly, clearly displeased with the turn of events. As the second deputy helped a relieved Riley to his feet, carefully assisting him with his injured leg, Thorne made a decision. The charade of anonymity was over. This wasn't just about one overzealous HOA officer. It was about an abuse of power that needed to be addressed at a higher level. The summary he'd read about HOA abuses now resonated with a disturbing clarity. This incident felt like a symptom of a larger disease. A large black SUV, the kind favored by private security firms trying to project an image of authority, pulled up. A man in a slightly more elaborate version of Slattery's uniform, with supervisor emblazoned on his chest, stepped out. He was large, imposing with a stern expression that seemed permanently fixed. He surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Thorne. What's going on here? Slattery, the supervisor whose name tag read Captain Henderson, no relation, Thorne presumed, to the distressed Mrs. Henderson, demanded. Slattery immediately launched into her narrative again, this time, with even more dramatic flair, gesturing towards Riley, as if he were a dangerous criminal, and then towards Thorne. And this man, Captain, has been interfering with my duties, undermining my authority. Captain Henderson turned his steely gaze on Thorne. And who might you be, sir, to interfere in official HOA security matters? Thorne met his gaze squarely. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I am not interfering, Captain. I am a witness to what I can only describe as a gross abuse of authority and an unwarranted assault on a disabled veteran who was performing an act of charity. The captain scoffed. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thorne. Officer Slattery is one of my best. Highly efficient. Efficient at terrorizing residents and volunteers, perhaps? Thorne said, his voice dangerously quiet. He then addressed Deputy Peterson. Deputy, I believe it's time I made a few calls. This situation is more serious than a simple neighborhood dispute. He pulled out his phone. Captain Henderson watched him, a smirk playing on his lips as if daring him. Slattery looked smug. Riley looked apprehensive again. Thorne scrolled through his contacts, then pressed a name. The phone rang twice. General McChrystal, please. Tell him it's General Thorne calling. Yes, Marcus Thorne. It's urgent. The effect of his words was instantaneous and profound. The smirk vanished from Captain Henderson's face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Slattery's jaw literally dropped. Deputy Peterson, who had been taking notes, looked up sharply, his eyes wide. Even Riley seemed to straighten up a little, a spark of something unreadable in his eyes. The air crackled with a new palpable tension. The midpoint twist had arrived not with a bang, but with a name and a rank that resonated with an authority far exceeding that of any HOA captain or county sheriff. Yes, Jack, it's Marcus. Thorne said into the phone, his tone shifting from the stern civilian to the familiar cadence of command. Sorry to bother you on short notice, but I've run into a rather ugly situation down here in Florida. Involves a disabled Army veteran being abused by what appears to be a rogue HOA security force. Yes, an HOA. You heard me right. He was delivering medication. They've accused him of all sorts, physically manhandled him. No local PD is here, but the HOA security seems to think they run the place. Look, Jack, this stinks. I need someone from your office, preferably JAG, to look into the legalities of these private security outfits and their arrest powers. And I need someone from CID to perhaps have a quiet word with the local authorities about proper procedure when a veteran is involved, especially one being clearly mistreated. Yes, I'm fine. More angry than anything. David Riley, former sergeant. Yes, I'll get his service number. The HOA is called Havenwood Estates. The officer in question is a Brenda Slattery senior patrol officer, and her supervisor a Captain Henderson of Havenwood Security Services. I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg, Jack. There's a systemic feel to this. Absolutely, I appreciate it. I'll be here. He ended the call and looked at the assembled group. Captain Henderson's face was pale. Slattery looked like she was about to be physically ill. Deputy Peterson was now looking at Thorne with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "General, sir." Peterson began, his voice respectful. I had no idea." "That's quite all right, Deputy," Thorne said, his tone softening slightly. "You were trying to do your job in a difficult situation. Now, perhaps we can ensure Mr. Riley receives the assistance he needs and that Mrs. Henderson gets her medication, which I trust is still viable." He gestured to the cooler. "And I would strongly recommend that Officer Slattery and Captain Henderson remain available for questioning by investigators who will likely have a much deeper understanding of jurisdictional authority and civil rights." Captain Henderson swallowed hard. "General Thorne, sir, perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Officer Slattery can be overzealous at times. We can resolve this internally." Internally. Thorne's voice was laced with cold disbelief. "Captain, what I witnessed today was not overzealousness. It was a calculated abuse of power. It was bullying. It was potentially criminal assault and false imprisonment. This will not be resolved internally. This will be investigated thoroughly and by the proper authorities, which I assure you extends beyond the purview of Havenwood Estates." The second deputy, who had been quietly observing, now spoke up. "Sir, we'll ensure Mr. Riley is looked after. We can take him to get checked out and we'll take his full statement. We'll also secure that medication and see if it can still be delivered or if a replacement is needed immediately." Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening with growing comprehension, stepped forward again. "General," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you. Thank you for standing up for David. He's a good man." "He is indeed, ma'am," Thorne said gently. "And no one who has served this country, or any citizen for that matter, should be treated this way." The arrival of General McChrystal's people was swift. Within 2 hours, a sharp-eyed major from the Judge Advocate General's Corps and 2 plainclothes investigators from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division were on site. They conferred quietly with Thorne, then with Deputy Peterson, who was more than cooperative, sharing his initial report and his unease about Slattery's conduct even before Thorne's intervention. The JAG major, a woman named Davies, then approached Captain Henderson and Officer Slattery. Her questioning was polite, precise, and utterly relentless. She inquired about their training, their understanding of state laws regarding citizens' arrest and use of force, the specific HOA bylaws they claimed Riley had violated, and the chain of command for Havenwood Security Services. Under her pointed inquiries, Slattery's bluster crumbled, replaced by monosyllabic answers and nervous fidgeting. Captain Henderson attempted to maintain a facade of professionalism, but it cracked under the weight of Major Davies's legal scrutiny. He admitted under duress that Havenwood Security had no formal training protocols recognized by state law enforcement agencies, and that their arrest powers were largely derived from HOA covenants that were, as Major Davies dryly pointed out, civil agreements, not criminal statutes. The CID investigators, meanwhile, were meticulously documenting the scene, photographing the spilled medication, Riley's minor injuries, bruises already forming on his arm and wrist, and taking statements from a suddenly very talkative group of neighbors. The woman with the poodle, Mrs. Gable, provided a damning account of Slattery's history of petty tyranny, recounting instances of bogus fines, verbal harassment of residents, and a general atmosphere of intimidation. Others echoed her sentiments, a dam of suppressed grievances finally breaking. It became clear that Slattery was not just an isolated problem, but a symptom of a deeply dysfunctional HOA management one that used its security force to enforce its will through fear. While the military personnel focused on the implications for Sergeant Riley and the jurisdictional overreach, Deputy Peterson, now galvanized, began looking into Havenwood Security's county licensing. He discovered that their business license permitted them to act as observers and reporters of suspicious activity, not as a de facto police force with powers of detention and arrest for minor civil covenant violations. The climax was not a single dramatic courtroom scene, but rather a meticulously orchestrated community meeting held a week later in the Havenwood Estates clubhouse. The room was packed. Mayor Thompson was present, as was the county sheriff himself, along with several local news reporters who had gotten wind of the General in the Suburbs story and the brewing HOA scandal. General Thorne sat quietly in the front row next to Sergeant Riley, who looked considerably better, his arm in a light sling, More for show, he'd joked to Thorne than necessity. Mrs. Henderson was beside him, beaming. The HOA president, a Mr. Albright, a man whose tanned, leathery skin spoke of too many hours on the golf course and too few dealing with actual governance, tried to open the meeting with platitudes about community harmony. He was quickly shouted down. Major Davies, at the invitation of the mayor, then gave a concise presentation on the limits of HOA security powers under state law. She outlined the potential civil and criminal liabilities faced by individuals and organizations that overstepped those bounds. Her words were a chilling indictment of Havenwood Security's practices. Then one by one, residents stood up. Mrs. Gable recounted her story. Another elderly resident told of being fined hundreds of dollars because his wind chimes were deemed noise pollution. A young couple described being threatened with liens on their property for planting a vegetable garden that wasn't on the approved landscaping list. The stories painted a picture of systematic abuse of an HOA board and its security arm, drunk on power levying exorbitant fines for minor infractions, creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment. Brenda Slattery and Captain Henderson were present, seated at a table with Mr. Albright, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Slattery attempted to speak to defend her actions regarding Riley, but her voice was drowned out by jeers. Captain Henderson sat stonily, his earlier arrogance gone. The county sheriff then announced that based on numerous complaints and evidence of financial irregularities discovered during the preliminary investigation into Havenwood Security's fining practices, kickbacks from preferred vendors for compliance work, for instance, his office was launching a full-scale criminal investigation into Havenwood Security Services and several members of the HOA board, including Mr. Albright. He stated that Officer Slattery had been arrested earlier that day on charges of assault battery and false imprisonment related to the incident with Sergeant Riley. Captain Henderson was also under investigation for conspiracy and aiding and abetting. The announcement was met with a stunned silence, then an eruption of applause. Mr. Albright looked ashen. General Thorne was then invited to speak. He stood not in his uniform, but as the quiet resident he had tried to be. My friends, my neighbors. He began, his voice calm but resonant. What happened to Sergeant David Riley was an outrage. It was an affront to decency, to justice, and to the service he rendered this nation. But it was also, as we have heard tonight, not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that had forgotten whom it was meant to serve. An HOA is supposed to protect property values and ensure community standards, yes, but it is not supposed to be a private tyranny. It is supposed to foster community, not fear. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. The actions you are seeing today, the investigations, the arrests, they are a beginning. They are a chance to reset, to rebuild this community based on respect, transparency, and true neighborliness. It will take courage. It will take vigilance. But I have seen the courage in this room tonight. I have seen the desire for change. He looked at Riley. Sergeant Riley showed us courage in the face of injustice. Mrs. Henderson showed us compassion. Let those be the values that guide Havenwood Estates forward. His words were met with a standing ovation. The meeting concluded with the mayor announcing the temporary suspension of the current HOA board and the appointment of an interim oversight committee, which included several respected residents and legal advisors, to manage Havenwood's affairs until new elections could be held under revised, fairer bylaws. In the falling action that followed, the consequences were swift and decisive. Brenda Slattery was found guilty of assault and false imprisonment. Given her lack of remorse and the evidence of her pattern of harassment, she received a short jail sentence and a hefty fine. Her career as a security officer was over. Captain Henderson, facing overwhelming evidence of his complicity in the systemic abuses and financial misdeeds, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a plea bargain that saw him avoid jail time, but resulted in significant financial penalties and a permanent ban from working in the security industry. Mr. Albright and 2 other board members were indicted for fraud and embezzlement related to HOA funds. The investigation revealed they had been siphoning money from excessive fines and kickback schemes for years. Their assets were frozen and forfeiture proceedings began. Havenwood Security Services was disbanded, its contract terminated. The county began a review of all private security firms operating within its jurisdiction, leading to stricter licensing and training requirements statewide. The statewide security overhaul, hinted at in the initial summary, became a reality, a direct result of the Havenwood scandal. For David Riley, life improved dramatically. The charges against him were, of course, immediately dropped. He received a formal apology from the county and the newly formed interim HOA committee. A local philanthropist moved by his story, and Thorne's advocacy set up a fund to support vets for vets, ensuring they could continue their vital work with better resources. Riley, no longer just a quiet volunteer, became a local hero, a symbol of resilience. He was even asked to join the new HOA Oversight Committee, bringing a much-needed perspective of compassion and common sense. Mrs. Henderson got her medication delivered that very first day by a sheepish but respectful county deputy, and her friendship with Riley deepened. The community of Havenwood Estates began to heal. The atmosphere of fear lifted, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and renewed engagement. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out now openly discussed ideas for improving their community. The oppressive silence was broken by the sounds of children playing more freely, of neighbors chatting over fences, of wind chimes, once again tinkling gently in the breeze without fear of reprisal. General Marcus Thorne stayed a few more weeks at Sarah's insistence. He quietly advised the interim committee, helping them draft new bylaws that emphasized resident rights and transparent governance. He had not sought the spotlight, but it had found him. Yet he deflected the praise, always pointing to the courage of Riley and the residents themselves. As he finally prepared to leave Havenwood, taking one last walk through its now genuinely peaceful streets, he reflected. He had sought respite from conflict, only to find it in an unexpected quarter, but he also found that the principles he had upheld his entire life, justice, integrity, and the defense of the vulnerable, were just as relevant on these quiet suburban streets as they had been on distant battlefields. The fight for what was right was a continuous one in myriad forms. Sergeant Riley and Mrs. Henderson came to see him off. Riley grasped his hand firmly. "General, I don't know how to thank you." Thorne smiled. "You already have, Sergeant, by being the man you are. Just keep doing what you do." He looked around at the transformed neighborhood. "And help these good people keep this place what it ought to be." The resolution was not just the punishment of the guilty, but the positive transformation of an entire community. The oppressive regime of the old HOA was dismantled, replaced by a system that was fair, transparent, and accountable. The property values, ironically, began to rise even more, not because of draconian rule enforcement, but because Havenwood became known as a truly desirable, welcoming place to live. The story of General Thorne and Sergeant Riley became a local legend, a reminder that one person or a few good people standing together could indeed make a profound difference. The positive, lingering impact was the enduring sense of empowerment and unity within Havenwood, and the ripple effect of reform that spread far beyond its manicured lawns, ensuring that the kind of abuse Riley suffered would be far less likely to happen to others. The sun, once a harsh interrogator, now seemed to bathe Havenwood Estates in a gentler, more hopeful light.